And sort of considering all of that, it's really baffling that McLaren took the decision that they decided to take, in that they just gave Verstappen a huge advantage.
I mean, they've made this so difficult for themselves. Even though Norris still pretty much has one hand on the trophy, you know, anything could go in any direction.
Because kind of the last guy you want to be on wheel to wheel with is Max Verstappen. Yeah. He's got something to lose now, but the last few weekends he's really been going into this fight with nothing to lose.
Hello everybody and welcome back to the Crash Formula 1 podcast. I'm your host Ian Mangan and joining me is Lewis Larkham. Well, it's happening. The championship fight will go to Abu Dhabi. Max Verstappen secures his 7th win of the season after a massive strategy blunder by the two McLaren's, and he now trails Norris by just 12 points heading into the final round. It's going to be a three-way fight in Abu Dhabi, something we haven't seen in quite some time. Lewis, I mean, we've loads to get through, but just to start, I mean, how did you enjoy the Qatar weekend? I think heading into the weekend, there was probably a little bit kind of resignation that this might be the one that Norris could just clean things up. And then there was actually a lot more drama and action to talk about.
Yeah, there was. I think, as you said, we sort of all kind of went into the weekend partly expecting, with McLaren's competitiveness in Qatar, we thought they would be the team to beat, which it turned out was the case. We thought that there was a pretty good chance that the title could be wrapped up this weekend. Obviously, Piastri had a big weekend and until what happened on Sunday, and looked to be sort of fighting back in the title race to keep it open and take it on to Abu Dhabi. And then what happened in the race, I don't think anyone could have foreseen coming. And we've got what we wanted in many ways, because we've got that 3-horse title fight going down right to the wire for the showdown in Abu Dhabi next weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it's really not what anyone expected, but it's what everyone wanted, really. And it's just been a fantastic season overall. I think we've loads to look forward to next week. It's a championship that has taken more turns than I think most people expected. Particularly this weekend was just pretty evident to that anything can go anyway. And Max Verstappen is just the one to watch, really. He's just been absolutely stunning throughout this whole championship. It's just given us so much to talk about, and that exuded through his confidence this weekend. I mean, let's get into the weekend in a little bit more detail, Lewis. I mean, before we talk about the race itself, I mean, Oscar Piastri was on for a really strong weekend overall. He managed to do pole in the sprint qualifying. He won the sprint race, pole in qualifying. It looked like he was back to where he was kind of around the time of Zandvoort and pre-Zandvoort. And this really felt pivotal in the championship. It felt like he could maybe swing things a little bit better in his direction. Ultimately, it was the McLaren's that made the massive error throughout the Grand Prix. I mean, let's get into, is this the fatal blow that could cost them this championship heading into next week? And what does Oscar take from this, more so even than Lando, considering that it really felt like his title fight, he has a mountain to climb now heading into Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, I mean, it was an excellent weekend from Piastri. He really was back to his best, after weekends in a row sort of going missing from this title fight and wondering, where things had gone wrong for him. He was right back to his best, and undoubtedly, I think, his best weekend since Zandvoort, and arguably his best weekend of the entire season, in terms of how he just put that weekend together and, got sprint pole, dominated the sprint race, pole position for the Grand Prix, likely would have won the Grand Prix on Sunday too. I think he was absolutely flawless, didn't put a foot wrong. And, this was a weekend that he really needed a response. He was running out of time to respond in this title fight. It's been slipping away from him for several weekends now. But he needed that response, and he delivered under pressure. He was dominant throughout the weekend. He was the quicker of the two McLaren drivers. He surely would have converted that pole into the win in the Grand Prix without McLaren's error. So he's right to be sort of shell-shocked. He was shell-shocked after the race. He was in disbelief. He said himself he was speechless. He had no words to sort of respond to what had happened. He was, right to feel aggrieved that he's lost a win through no fault of his own, and that could have been absolutely pivotal for his championship, because those extra 7 points would have taken the gap down to 9 going into the final weekend against Norris, he would have been second in the championship. He's now slipped to third, and he's 16 points back. So it makes his job even harder, and it probably is too little, too late for Piastri after those several poor weekends that have ultimately cost him. I think when he reflects back, that clearly is kind of I think the damage had already been done. But he's still in the hunt. There's you can't rule him out. He's 16 points back. As we saw this weekend, you cannot predict. Even when you think it's predictable, something always happens, and you can't predict what's going to happen. And Abu Dhabi, we've seen in the past as well, when and not just Abu Dhabi, but championship deciding races, particularly when there's two or three, more guys in the hunt, two different teams at it, things can happen that nobody foresaw coming. And it is still all to play for, but certainly losing those 7 points will really hurt Piastri.
Yeah, big time. I think that ultimately his disappointment with the team really shone through yesterday. And I think at times there's been a lot of speculation as to what his relationship has been like with the team up to now as well. This will not have helped that speculation around that too. I mean, ultimately, it was just a team blunder that affected both drivers as well. This wasn't a case of anyone being, prioritized over the other. So it was just an unfortunate team error, essentially, which we can get into what McLaren's thinking was really around that. But before we kind of get into that, what mistake they actually kind of made, let's talk about Norris as well, Lewis. I mean, his performance this weekend, honestly, was quite disappointing considering the run of form that he's been on over the last couple of days. His pace really wasn't quite as there as Piastri's all throughout the weekend. He couldn't really put the qualifying laps together as well as he could. Ultimately, he didn't need a lot to win the championship this weekend. I think he needed to basically win the race. And what was it? I think P6 in the sprint or something like that. And P6 and above. And okay, he got P3 in the sprint race, but then the Grand Prix, he had made his life a little bit more difficult, not qualifying on pole. And we know that with this track, it's turn one or nothing, which everyone said was going to be that pressure on Norris to make that move initially. Then obviously, strategy error aside, it seemed like he was struggling throughout the race. You could hear, he had a few moments on his radio saying, I need a bit more encouragement here to his race engineer. I need a little bit more help on guidance around how he was driving the car. And he was definitely struggling. And I mean, is it weekends like this where, Norris could then lose it? I mean, we've got Abu Dhabi next week. It's not really a massive confidence boost to him, even though he does have the points advantage.
It's funny, isn't it, that when everything looks so simple, it doesn't turn out to be as straightforward as in on paper should have been. Given his form recently, another weekend like that, just repeat what he's been doing so successfully those last few weekends, and the championship would have been wrapped up and sealed. And as we sort of said, going to this weekend, it looked like he was the heavy favourite to do that potentially this weekend. And yeah, it was a bit of a scrappy weekend from Norris, just when he didn't need it. And this is crunch point now, and you wonder, were the sort of title nerves starting to play on his mind? He came into the weekend, he was very relaxed, very calm. Sort of downplayed all of the talk of the title. He was just like, I'm just going to get my head down, focus on this one race at a time. Same approach that I've taken the last few races. Just try and get pole position, try and win the sprint race, try and win the Grand Prix, and the rest will take care of itself. Obviously, that's not how it panned out. And the weekend didn't quite go to plan for Norris. He was behind Piastri in every session that mattered. And, even then, it seemed like he was on course to kind of do enough with that, what would have been a sort of a worst case third place before the strategy fumble from McLaren. That would have, just kept giving him a nice buffer going to the final race. He was fortunate as well to gain fourth place right at the end. And those 2 points that he gained could be absolutely crucial, because it's given him a 12-point buffer instead of what would have been a 10-point buffer had he finished fifth. And that could make all the difference come the end of the season. He's still in a strong position, and it wasn't a disaster of a weekend. It wasn't a particularly bad weekend from him. It was just not ideal and not the kind of performance he would have been hoping for. But ultimately, he is still in the best place going into Abu Dhabi. He just needs to finish on the podium and he's world champion, no matter what his rivals do. Even fourth is enough for him as long as Verstappen doesn't win. but you just never know what will happen under the pressure, as we saw this weekend.
Yeah, I think you touched on something there where when things are going right for Norris, it really feels like that he can really collect a really perfect weekend. He can get everything to work in his direction, but it does feel like when there is a bit of a setback, he struggles to fight against those setbacks. Whereas we've seen with Max throughout the course of this season, oftentimes there's been setbacks for him throughout multiple sessions throughout the weekend, and then he pulls together a fantastic Sunday. And ultimately, I think, we really don't know what's going to happen next week, but most people feel it's more than likely that we'll be, saying that Lando Norris will be world champion come next Sunday. We can't guarantee that, as we keep saying, because it's just been so unpredictable. But I think this weekend did say a little bit about his performance kind of overall across the season. I know it's been a tough championship battle for him. And I mean, he does need to be commended to keep fighting until the end. But I think compared to Max, just how strong Max is. Now, ultimately, Max has been in more championship fights than he has been. He's been in this situation before many, many times, but there's been a confidence about Max in these last few races, hasn't there? Where, he was speaking to the media before and saying, look, if we had their car, this championship would have been over a long time ago. He's confident in his abilities this year. And I wonder, is that also playing on Lando's mind too, that Max has been really, really confident in how he's performed. And I think that kind of showed this weekend that when Red Bull were really reactive to that strategy call, and Max was able to just really control the race as soon as he got out in front.
Yeah, there were certainly some mind games going on, weren't there, with sort of Verstappen just sort of poking the McLaren bear with his comments, and he's just having a great time, isn't he? He's just absolutely enjoying it, because
he's loving it.
He never thought he was going to win this title, and he kind of has no right to be where he is, really. McLaren should have wrapped this up a long time ago. We shouldn't be talking that he's in contention, but that is ultimately down to his phenomenal performances. And as we said in the previous podcast, I think he's been the best driver this season, sort of hands down, if you look at the whole season. And it's those performances that have kept him in touching distance, and he's just able to keep applying the pressure to McLaren and to Norris, and they're cracking under the pressure. If we get into the strategy mistake, there's no two ways about it. It was a monumental screw up from McLaren.
So let's just recap on that, Lewis, before we get into that. So obviously, heading into the weekend, there was this rule in place in Qatar that there was going to be 2 mandatory pit stops. You couldn't run your tyres for more than 25 laps. Most of the teams would have taken that into account heading into the Grand Prix. What threw things up into a bit of confusion was, of course, that early safety car, which was around, I think, was it lap 8, which was
seven.
Lap 7.
Yeah.
So, which was already kind of becoming a bit of a critical time for making a decision about what to do with the tyres. Of course, pretty much every team pits except for the McLaren. So, Lewis, let's talk through why that decision was made ultimately and how it cost them the race, really.
Yeah, well, coincidentally, the safety car coming out on lap 7 actually then made it that perfect 2-stop race for the teams, because you had then 2 exact 25 lap stints. And as you said, that was enforced due to concerns about tyre wear. It's a high-speed track in Qatar, and we've seen issues in the past. So that was kind of the situation going into the race. And then, as I said, McLaren screwed up. But in hindsight, obviously easy to say, but I think it looked fairly obvious during the race. There were question marks over why have McLaren kept their drivers out here when literally everybody else pits, including Verstappen. I think it's pretty obvious that they should have pitted at least one car or even double stacked their cars. And they've ultimately handed victory on a plate to their main rival, Max Verstappen, which is the worst thing they could have possibly done. They clearly messed up, because in what world is it a good idea to effectively concede 25 seconds of race time and track position to, of all people, Max Verstappen? And we know as well, not just in Qatar, but it's been the story of this season that running in dirty air, track position is king this season particularly. And we've seen the amount of times where there have been drivers behind on fresher tyres, and it's looked like that would be the optimum strategy to be on, but they can't make it work. They can't actually get past because the effect of dirty air is so great. And sort of considering all of that, it's really baffling that McLaren took the decision that they decided to take, in that they just gave Verstappen a huge advantage, and he is not the kind of driver that's going to not lap that up, and he absolutely capitalized on it and won the race. I think when Piastri came out, he was around 18, 19 seconds behind Verstappen, and that felt like a big ask, even on fresh tyres. Piastri is great, and he did a fantastic job in that final stint. His pace was phenomenal, but he's up against Max Verstappen, and Verstappen's tyres were in a good place. He was in control out front, and it always felt a bit of a long shot. I wasn't convinced at any point that he was able to cut that gap down. I think he got it down to just under 8 seconds come the checkered flag, but he was given way too much to do. And then let's say he had managed to cut that gap down, he's then got to make that pass on Max Verstappen, which again puts McLaren's drivers in a difficult spot, because kind of the last guy you want to be on wheel to wheel with is Max Verstappen. Yeah. He's got something to lose now, but the last few weekends he's really been going into this fight with nothing to lose. He's the guy.
He would not have conceded that position.
No, he's got everything to gain. The McLaren drivers couldn't afford to get in a scrap with Verstappen, suffer damage, potentially, race-ending damage that would lose all these points. They couldn't afford to do that, and yeah, McLaren have really fumbled this, because they've just a race that they should have absolutely won. Probably should have got a 1-2 in on outright performance. They've somehow managed to come away with a second place and a fourth, and the guy that's won the race is their main competitor, and they've just, for the second weekend running, through their own mistakes, have hemorrhaged huge points to Max Verstappen, and they will only have themselves to blame at the end of the day if they end up throwing this championship away.
It's really weird, isn't it? I mean, they've looked like this really in control outfit for so much of the season. They've had the constructors wrapped up for so long, and this driver's title there is a psychological element to this that's one affecting the drivers, and it's affecting the team as well. And a decision like this, Lewis, had everyone scratching their heads. No one could figure out. I mean, while I was watching the broadcast live, there was a moment when I believe it might have been Lando speaking to his engineer, saying, Lando kind of said, surely we should have followed, the rest of them in to the pits there. His engineer came back and said, this gives us more options. We have more wiggle room here. They're all going to have to pit again in 25 laps. But as you said, they lost so much time losing track position there. Also, it was a little bit of a worry pitting both of the drivers then as well following on. It looked actually briefly like at one moment that Norris could have potentially gained a position on Piastri. Now, thankfully for McLaren, that didn't happen. If that had happened, how would the team have even managed that? They could have gotten themselves in an even worse position. So ultimately, it was then after that damage limitation, getting Oscar to push so hard on those tires at the end. Again, as you said, it was a great stint from Oscar. He drove really, really well. It was great pace, but they were asking far too much of him. And then Norris was struggling too on that final stint as well. Yeah. There was no real signs that he was making any inroads there as well. So, I mean, they've made this so difficult for themselves. Even though Norris still pretty much has one hand on the trophy, anything could go in any direction. And we felt that, most people would have felt that, and the McLaren is suited to Qatar more than any of the other cars. And I think, Max was really downplaying their performance heading into the weekend. He was saying, I don't think the car is going to have nearly as much pace. Now, I think Max often does that. He downplays things quite a bit, and Red Bull, they can see a little bit of struggles in the earlier sessions throughout the weekend, and then they kind of put things together quite well on the Sunday, which again, once the car is in Max's hands, I think he can extract, fantastic results out of that. But ultimately here, this was McLaren's race to lose, as you said, and Red Bull now have made things a lot easier for themselves as well. They're going to be hungry for that fight, just to say that we fought it down to the last lap. And they can say that heading into the race. They can say we fought that to the absolute bitter end. I mean, heading into this weekend from McLaren's perspective, Lewis, how do they play this with their two drivers? I mean, we haven't really gone back to this papaya rules thing in a while, because it kind of felt like it was sorting itself out. I mean, ultimately, Lando is the one with the best chance of winning. As you said, all he needs to do is finish on the podium. So you would think that that would be the attitude of the team. But I mean, given Oscar's performance, they have to give him just as fair a shot at the title fight as well next week.
As you said, McLaren have really kind of dug themselves into a hole here, and it's we saw it coming. We saw it coming months ago. You know, as far back as the Italian Grand Prix and that whole swap around. McLaren's determination to keep it fair and equal between their drivers, I think, we said it back then, could ultimately be their downfall in this World Championship. And, you know, as I said, if they end up throwing away this championship, they will only have themselves to blame. It's, I think as well that the papaya rules, this whole, trying to be fair, give their drivers an equal chance. I think that did play a role in the strategy decision as well in Qatar, because they were in a bit of a tricky situation there where, had they double stacked, for example, which seemed that was ultimately, in hindsight, the way they should have gone, Norris would have lost out. He would have potentially dropped further back in the field, and clearly that was on their mind. But then they have the dilemma of, do they do a double stack and Norris potentially loses out and then has to fight his ways through the field, which I think in that circumstance would have been the better way to go anyway? Or do they bring one of their drivers in? And then how do they make that call? Because, as you said, they're trying to keep this fair. They're trying to not be perceived to be favouring one driver over the other. But it's a clear call in that sense, because Piastri is the guy ahead. He's the guy who's the quicker of the two McLaren drivers. And he is the one who should be prioritised first in that sense, as is the normal case. A driver will pit their lead driver first 9 times out of 10. That's kind of the way these things go. And that would have been the sensible thing to do as well. In the end, they end up tripping themselves up by not pitting either driver and hurting both drivers' chances. And not only has, Norris come away losing significant ground to Verstappen, but Piastri's been hurt even more on a weekend that he deserved to win, by losing those additional 7 points to Norris and Verstappen. I think, McLaren are now they are really in a tricky spot, even more tricky than they were before, because they've come out and insisted that nothing's going to change despite what's happened. They're still going to stick to this principle of keeping things fair and letting both drivers have equal chance of winning. And, Andrea Stella was even saying after the race, Piastri's, we've seen in the past that the guy who's third in the championship can come out and win. And we have seen that in the past, but he's kind of referring to the fact that Piastri's still got every chance of winning. But 16 points behind, they need to be focusing more on Max Verstappen.
It's the one decision that they don't want to go down to the last race, and yet this has happened now. It's where it's happening. And as you said, Lewis, as well, this isn't just a straight fight between their two drivers now. You've got this Max Verstappen equation now, which makes it even more complicated. Ultimately, losing out to Max would be disastrous for the team. Now, I mean, Zach has conceded that they always entertained the thought that Max could be, a challenger throughout. I mean, I think that Zach is saying that a lot more now as Max has kind of chopped that points gap down. He said earlier in the year as well, if we were to lose the championship, we'd want it to be to someone like him of his caliber. But that is ridiculous. It's the most ridiculous thing to say. You do not want to say, well, we lost to the best. It's just, you should be embarrassed because you've built this fantastic package and you should have two drivers that can put it to him. And they will be absolutely fuming, and I think doing some massive amounts of soul searching if they lose to Max in this final race. I think it feels like a weird kind of trepidation heading into the last couple of races towards Max.
Yeah. I mean, you have to wonder whether he truly believed when they originally made this statement months ago, and I think the points gap was obviously significantly bigger than it is now. You have to wonder whether they truly believed Verstappen would come back into it, because they've got, the better car. They're in the way better situation. I don't think they could have ever imagined it got as close as it has done now, which is absolutely the worst case scenario for them. But I mean, I think Zach even said recently as I think an interview gave on the 6th of November at the start of this month, saying again, repeating that he would rather lose the title to Verstappen than favour one driver over the other. And at this rate, he's going to be made to absolutely eat those words, and we are going to see that 2007 style title loss defeat somehow. It is just as in Qatar, it was McLaren's race to lose and they lost it. It's McLaren and Lando Norris's title to lose, and there is a serious risk that they do lose this to Max Verstappen. They, as I said, they've insisted nothing will change, which baffles me, because if they are serious about winning this title, they have to back Lando Norris at this point. He, 12 points ahead of Verstappen and 16 clear of Piastri. A repeat of Qatar and the hesitation would just hand the title on a plate to Verstappen, who have Red Bull, let's not forget, backing him all the way and have been for months. And this is almost where that, it's seen that a 2 against 1 fight favours the team with the numerical advantage. But actually, in this case, the 2 against 1 is hurting McLaren, and it hurt them in Qatar. It confuses things. It adds another element to the dilemma, and they have to then think, how is this fair? How do we navigate through this? Meanwhile, Red Bull can just focus on the optimum strategy for Max Verstappen and think about what is best for Max Verstappen, and that's all they're focusing on, and that is why they're able to deliver and give him the best opportunity, and then he is just grabbing that and delivering with his performances on track. I think McLaren, they, as much as they don't want to, and as much as they are refusing to go this way, they need to be ruthless now. They don't have the luxury that they once had in terms of being able to sort of play around with this and be able to look back on the season and say, we got involved as little as possible and we let it down to the drivers and the best man won. That is what McLaren want to come away from this season saying. That may still happen. Abu Dhabi, we go into that race. McLaren, again, should be favourites there. But you just can't rule out Max and Red Bull. It doesn't matter. Like, the form book just goes out the window because Verstappen just finds this extra level, and Red Bull are giving him every opportunity to extract these kind of performances. So you can't bank on the fact that McLaren are going to necessarily have the quickest car in Abu Dhabi. You also can't bank on even if they're 1-2 in the race, you just never know what's going to happen. A safety car, anything like this, could throw it wide open. And we know how aggressive Red Bull are. We know they will do absolutely everything and take every opportunity that they can to try and get this title across the line for Verstappen. McLaren have surely got to back one driver now. Otherwise, if they end up losing the title because they are too busy trying to keep things fair, then they've only got themselves to blame.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of us sounding like a broken record, because it has been the conversation of the season, do they eventually decide to back a driver? And I think you're right, Lewis. They have to just be aggressive and go, we cannot concede this to Max under any circumstances, and we're going to upset Oscar massively. I guess the other issue is, I think Oscar is upset with the team already.
Yeah.
I think at that point you're kind of saying, it doesn't matter. Oscar is mad as it is already. The year hasn't gone the way he had hoped. But we're going to back Lando because it's the easiest path for us to get this win, and we can just say we've won both, and we'll deal with the Oscar situation later, because they're trying to play this diplomatically. But I mean, I know it's very early days, Lewis, but I could see a world where Oscar Piastri decides, I'm going to start looking elsewhere in the next few years, especially with next year with the McLaren performance as well. It's still too early to say that. Obviously, look, they gave McLaren this year that could fight for the championship, and he won so many races this year, so ultimately he can look back in this year already at this point in the season and say, I've done a very good job with this team. It was the right career move for me. But there is tensions brewing there, and in there trying to keep both drivers happy, they're actually, I think, upsetting some of the drivers as well. And ultimately, I think we've seen in the past where you can bend over backwards for a driver, but if a driver makes a decision that they want to leave, it just happens. A driver will just ultimately look out for themselves, as they should. They are absolutely number one in the situation as well. So I do wonder, has this kind of still going to end up where, McLaren will lose one of those drivers at some point? I mean, they're going to lose one of those drivers at some point in the future anyway. Maybe it's not at that point now with Oscar, but after this weekend, he really was upset with the team. Even he posted it on Instagram, a picture of him looking at the trophy, no caption on it. It reiterated his kind of speechless kind of comments before. maybe I'm being too preemptive, Lewis. But is there a future where Oscar says maybe this team isn't for me, or I have their backing already, or and has that kind of thought maybe entered his thought process already heading into the final this week?
I I think this is the other side to this whole dilemma that McLaren have got, is that Oscar Piastri will be upset, obviously, if they end up favouring Norris, and particularly it will be a double whammy blow for him, given that he felt rightly he absolutely deserved to win that race and should have been, within touching distance of a title, and kind of having that equal opportunity as Norris, and through no fault of his own, he's ended up now on the back foot and could be sort of the sacrificial lamb in that sense. Now, obviously, the whole situation gets complicated if, let's say let's say Piastri ends up quicker than Norris and out qualifying him, then the picture gets even more complicated from McLaren. That is almost the nightmare scenario now for them, is that Piastri ends up on pole with Norris alongside him, or Max Verstappen in between them, or Max Verstappen third. That really makes things difficult. I think McLaren's life is made a lot easier if Norris outperforms Piastri, because then in the race they've got the kind of, they can fall back on that, can't they? They can then say, okay, now we need to prioritise Norris. And I think if Piastri is outperformed by Norris fair and square, I don't think he can have too many complaints. It will be a bit of a pill to swallow, but I don't think he would have too many complaints if he's then asked in the race situation, if he's behind Norris, to try and, to ultimately help Norris out if he needed to. I think ultimately, again, you've got to look back on it and think those 6 or 7 weekends where he just went missing were where he lost the title, not due to the last weekend of the season being, you're potentially having to play that kind of role. But he has, I think he definitely will have started to question his position at McLaren. I think we sort of got the hints of that as early as what happened after Monza, where he admitted recently that he was that was playing on his mind when he went into Baku, which obviously ended up being an absolute horror weekend and kind of started this run of terrible form that's seen him sort of slip those championship hopes. At one point he looked the favourite, and it's now faded away. I do think it's something for him to get. Obviously, at the moment, he's still in the best team with the best car, and no driver wants to give that up. So I think in some ways it maybe is slightly early to preempt that, but this is, again, McLaren's kind of own problem they've created by, rightly in many ways, wanting to have the two best drivers available and having that kind of two alpha team lineup where they've got two drivers who are, as good as each other, that can equally win the world championship. That is a dilemma that then falls from this. They can't both win the championship, therefore they both can't be happy. And you do wonder how the dynamics will play out in the team if Norris secures this title. The team will say, okay, it all starts from zero again next year, and we'll give equal treatment to both drivers again. I'm sure they will continue with that, that kind of stance that they've had all year long. I'm sure that won't change, but you do wonder then, Norris has just got that momentum on his side. Does the team subconsciously start to kind of gravitate towards Norris as the world champion? And those kind of things will surely play on Piastri's mind over the winter if that's how things turn out. And the 2026 driver market could be absolutely volatile. We're expecting some big changes there going into 2027, and doors could open elsewhere. And the other thing here is, obviously, we don't know how the championship pitch is going to look next year, and in terms of, this is the other side to this whole intriguing battle that we've got going on for the title, is that there's no guarantees that McLaren are going to be this strong next year.
No.
This could be Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri's only chance of winning a world championship, and whoever loses that is then going to be thinking, what next? Particularly if next season doesn't pan out the way McLaren hope, and they aren't as competitive, and maybe they slip down the pecking order a bit. I think if that happens and Piastri's lost the title, then sure, maybe he starts to think, am I better off looking elsewhere and considering his options? Every driver has to. Every driver has to put themselves first at the end of the day and look at what is best for them. And there could be openings at Red Bull. There could be openings at Aston Martin, potentially at Mercedes, maybe even Ferrari in the next 2 or 3 years. And I think next year will be key for a lot of drivers, but also Piastri in that decision in terms of, does he stick with McLaren or does he potentially look elsewhere to kind of maybe join a team where he is the sort of de facto number one, even if it's not necessarily written in the contract, but he is the guy that the team build around, because that might give him the best chance of going on and winning world championships, particularly if Norris ends up winning this title. It's another difficult dilemma, but ultimately one that kind of McLaren have brought upon themselves by choosing to go this way, and it's proven to be the right call in many ways, because it's won them the last 2 constructors championships and they're on the verge of winning a driver's title. So it is a successful formula, but it's so difficult to manage. Think back to Mercedes having Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton, and yes, they won multiple world championships together and had huge amounts of success, but it was not easy for Mercedes to manage. McLaren has so far avoided the kind of tension, the kind of fierce, bitter rivalry that we got to see with between Hamilton and Rosberg, where things really got out of hand at times. Thankfully for McLaren, they've managed to avoid that, and that is also, kudos to them to some extent to managing this and keeping everything harmonious. But there comes a point when that is going to break, because it just can't be sustainable. And as I said, ultimately, Piastri and Norris, they want to win. That's all they care about. And one of them is going to end up unhappy, potentially both of them, at the end of this year. And they've got to start looking out for themselves. So I wouldn't rule it out, the possibility that Piastri could leave McLaren, and perhaps it might be the best thing for him in the future. But I think a lot of that will ultimately come down to next season.
Yeah, it's interesting timing, isn't it? Because I think over the last few generations of Formula E, we've seen that teams can get a kind of a quite dominant run, and they usually will then have a kind of star driver to get them that multi-championship position. Obviously we saw it with Mercedes, when they had Lewis Hamilton, it was going to be this run of dominance that they wanted. Prior to that, it had been Sebastian Vettel with Red Bull, and then Max Verstappen again with Red Bull. And so that's kind of the way things have gone in the world of Formula One over the last kind of 2 decades. But we're in a kind of an interesting position now where actually, different teams could have different shots at the title in different years, and especially heading into next year. So in that sense, Red Bull have had things a little bit easier, because they said, but Max is our multi-championship winning guy, and we're going to get multiple championships with him, and we're going to continue to get more championships with him. Whereas McLaren are fighting their feet again as championship winners, and they haven't won a driver's title in so long that, whoever comes out on top, it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't feel like they have that one driver where they go, well, this driver is going to give us multiple championships back to back. They're not taking that approach. It's, we have 2 great drivers and they're going to fight to the end. So it will be really interesting to see, one, how the year, ends up, and we'll have loads to be talking about, Lewis, I think, after next week's race, regardless of the result. There's so many moving parts to the story. But I wanted to touch on as well, Lewis, kind of relevant to Lando's performance over the weekend. Obviously, he was getting quite frustrated behind Kimi Antonelli. Ultimately, then, he did manage to take back P4 in the race, and as you said, 2 more crucial championship points heading into the final round. But one of the kind of big stories that has emerged from the weekend was Red Bull's very interesting kind of conspiracy theory that they're running, that Antonelli essentially let Norris pass. This was first said by Giampiero Lambiase, Max's engineer, over the radio, which was broadcast out on the live feeds, that he basically said, look, Antonelli let him pass, which one was very strange, but you can put that down to the emotion of the moment, although I would argue that engineers shouldn't be the emotional equation in that. They should be level-headed in that. And then, of course, it was repeated by Helmut Marko, who's not afraid of a controversial comment as well. Toto Wolff absolutely excoriated the claims, has shut them down massively, and said, absolute nonsense. And I think everyone can see that it is nonsense. Kimi went off there, and it was a frustration for him. And he's fighting for more positions. Mercedes are fighting for positions in the constructors' championship. But I guess what I wanted to get into, Lewis, was why does it feel like Red Bull feels like they have to throw these kind of wild claims out when, they have actually had a really good season outside of obviously the turbulence with that team, the turbulence with the second driver, but they've delivered with Max really, and it feels like they don't need to throw these kind of grenades out there when
Yeah.
ultimately they're doing quite a good job and are fighting for the driver's title, and it just feels like a bit of a weird paranoia for a team like that to have at this point in the season when they've been kind of relaxed about fighting for the drivers' championship.
Yeah, it was totally unnecessary to like you say, they don't need to be making those kind of accusations when they're doing a good enough job. But that kind of is the sort of Red Bull way, don't they? They fight for world championships on every front. Perhaps saw that a bit more when Christian Horner was in charge of the team. But they will fight it on track and off track, and they will do everything to gain every little competitive advantage possible. But these comments were just absolute nonsense, as Toto Wolff said. And you can kind of understand the Lambiase comment in the sense that it's in the heat of the moment. He's not really partial to exactly everything that's going on. He's focusing on his driver. He's seen that the position swapped, has made his comment. Perhaps that can be put down to heat of the moment, but Helmut Marko has just stoked this even more with his post-race comments. And as you said, he's not afraid to do that. He often does come out and say something controversial, but ultimately it's irresponsible because Kimi Antonelli has actually turned his profile picture black on Instagram now and has faced a barrage of online abuse. And nobody warrants that. No, nothing that's happened on track warrants that. But certainly not. He's a 19-year-old kid at the end of the day. This is just unnecessary and is irresponsible by Red Bull. Interestingly, they've actually just put out a statement while we've been recording this podcast and said that they sincerely regret that this has led to Kimi receiving online abuse. So clearly there is regret within Red Bull, and this again it stems down to more Helmut Marko just sort of shouting his mouth off as he often does and giving kind of Red Bull a headache that they didn't really, they certainly didn't need, and they didn't really want to. I don't think it was their intention necessarily to come out and start making these accusations. Obviously, the Lambiase comment prompted a bit of fire on social media and everything, but I don't think anything more would have been said of that until Helmut Marko gets a mic shoved in his face and comes out and says something ridiculous, which he has a tendency to do. And he's often caused Red Bull headaches by kind of saying these controversial comments. But just kind of to address the conspiracy theory in the first place, which is absolute nonsense. Firstly, why would Mercedes even do it? They're trying to secure, yes, obviously they supply engines to McLaren, but they are as embarrassed as anybody to be losing to their customer team in F1. They want to be winning, and they're seeing a car powered by their own engine beating them. They're trying to secure second place in the Constructors' Championship, which they've almost done now. They've practically done it. But, that is their aim. I think we can assume that Yuki Tsunoda's probably not going to get the points alongside Verstappen to overhaul Mercedes. But they're fighting for second place in the Constructors' Championship. And Kimi Antonelli is trying to beat Lewis Hamilton to sixth place in the Drivers' Championship, which, okay, you could look at and think, oh, well, that's not really a big story. But for Kimi Antonelli, it is. It's his rookie F1 season, and finishing sixth in the championship is obviously better than finishing seventh. And in doing so, beating seven-time world champion Lewis Hamilton, the man who he replaced at Mercedes, would be a nice little way for Kimi Antonelli's season to end, particularly after going through that tough run of form. He would have leapfrogged Hamilton had he finished fourth in Qatar. He lost those 2 points and is now 2 points behind. So there's no reason for Antonelli or Mercedes to give that place up. Also, even if this was a big conspiracy, if he was going to let Norris through, why not do it earlier and boost Norris' chances of getting Sainz in third as well? If Mercedes really wanted, McLaren and Norris to win this world title, they could have made it a lot easier for him. It's just crazy accusations. But as I said, Red Bull have now come out and sort of publicly stated that they regret what's happened, the comments that were made, and that ultimately it's led to Antonelli receiving abuse, which is just completely unwarranted and really unfortunate to see. He doesn't deserve that.
No, I mean, obviously Red Bull would have gone into that as well, saying that we can't be responsible for what people say online. But it is good to hear that they kind of do bear a bit of responsibility there for saying that the comments shouldn't have led to this ultimately. And I mean, it is good to see that they're actually at least addressing it too. As you said, Lewis, it just feels a little bit like a completely bizarre accusation to make. It just made zero sense. I think everyone came away from that thinking. And as you said, GP, you could just dice that up to it was in the heat of the moment in the race, and there was a lot of pressure there for Max to deliver, and it just came out of the radio. And as you said, I actually don't think anything much more would have come of it. People would have said, well, that was a weird remark to make, but don't fuel it anymore. And Marco did. And it's just, yeah, it's just not necessary for a team like Red Bull that have also, this year have been kind of almost trying to tidy up their act a little bit to say, like, we're not really that kind of team anymore. We don't really do the Horner antics that used to go on. He's gone now, and we've headed into this kind of more tidied up approach with Laurent Mekies, the engineer, running the team. And but they are still that kind of maverick team, at heart, and these things can get thrown out. It was a real throwback to kind of some of the weird storylines in the past as well. But I mean, it is good to hear that Red Bull have denounced the abuse that Kimi Antonelli is getting, and look, ultimately he did a fantastic job on the race day as well. And I mean, it was clearly a mistake on his end. You could actually see on the onboard that he went off, and he will be looking at that going, one, I've lost a place, and then two, to be accused of doing that intentionally minimizes his performance this season as well. To think that he would stoop to that level. And also, I do wonder sometimes, is that Red Bull are ultimately the only company on the F1 grid with two teams essentially under one umbrella. Trying to kind of push a kind of intra-team agreement among other teams is just bizarre, because no other team has that close relationship that too. Now, that's not to say that Red Bull are conspiring with the Racing Bulls at all. They're two separate outfits, very much so, that compete against each other, and that's always been the case. But it's just a ridiculous accusation for a team like that to make ultimately overall as well. It was just a bizarre end, I think, to the weekend, and a weird thing for Red Bull to say after they had such a good race, really.
Just on GP as well, I think Toto Wolff came out and said afterwards that he had actually spoken to GP in the paddock, and that he had apologised to him, and they'd kind of cleared the air with that as well. So that had kind of killed off that story that, yes, as we know, comments are made in the heat of the moment over team radio, and they obviously get blown up because they are selected for TV broadcast. Everyone hears them. They go all over social media. It's kind of hard to control that element, but yeah, it did seem like Mercedes and Red Bull had kind of cleared the air, at least from GP's comments there, because he'd spoken to Toto and I think apologised to Toto and sort of said, look, I didn't really have the full facts. I was just, emotional in the moment, kind of made a silly comment, but that had kind of been sorted. It was more, I think, Helmut Marko's comments that really sort of stoked this, and now Red Bull have subsequently sort of, apologised effectively and said they regret what's happened.
Yeah, I guess we shouldn't be surprised by Dr. Marco causing controversy at this rate in the season as well. Well, that is it for us this week. Next week, it goes to Abu Dhabi. It is going to be an absolute blockbuster finish to the season, arguably one of the most exciting ends to a season we've had in years. So obviously, there's going to be lots to talk about heading into the season as well. So make sure you head over to crash.net to stay up to date with all the latest news and analysis. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we'll be back next week